Okay, so I guess we can get started. So before we start, I would like to thank the HARI, Hagen Avicultural Research Institute, for sponsoring this event, as well as providing the food. And I put my email address here as well, so if you have any question about this talk, about your cases, or about emergencies in birds or other exotic mammals, just send me an email. And today I'm going to be talking about common emergencies, but mainly emergency stabilization of birds, and a very brief overview of the common emergency presentation that we see here at the UVC. So first, emergency presentations are common in pet birds because they have an incredible ability to hide diseases, and incredible ability to compensate for severe illnesses. Also, most of the bird owners are quite unfamiliar with avian biology and clinical signs of disease. So that makes birds more susceptible to chronic disease, and early signs of disease are not recognized soon enough. Also, birds have incredibly high metabolism, which means that the pathogenesis of diseases is much faster. So birds get sicker much faster as well, and they decompensate much faster as well. Also, female cetacean birds have a fairly high reproductive drive, which means in practice that you're going to be seeing a lot of reproductive associated diseases, such as egg binding or coelomitis or egg yolk related issues. And trauma are quite frequent as well in pet cetacean birds and other avian species. So I just would like to emphasize that sometimes working with birds and with small species, we tend to forget the fundamentals of medicine. And I think bird is a good example because they are very unfamiliar. Their physiology and anatomy are different. So we tend to make shortcuts, and we tend to use more cookbook type medicine where it's always the same protocol for every single emergency. So just do not forget to practice good medicine and good evidence-based medicine. Try using a problem-oriented approach as you would use in dogs and cats. And it will be very hard for you to be successful in avian emergencies, dealing with avian emergencies, if you do not acquire the basic knowledge on avian anatomy, physiology, and their diseases. And you should try to limit empirical medicine and overemphasis on personal experience as much as possible. You should try to stick to scientific facts if they are available. So the same standard of care should be applied for birds than for dogs and cats. When birds live for very long, they have a very intense human-bond relationship with their owner because they live for so long. They are very smart. They can experience significant distress. So I think we have an obligation to treat them with the highest standard of care possible. And the motivation to increase your avian caseload should be accompanied by the obligation to acquire avian-specific knowledge. And nowadays, there are a lot of books, conferences, journals, internet resources that you can consult in order to improve your knowledge on birds and other exotic species as well. So emergency stabilization follows the same basic concept than mammals. Basically, diagnosis should be obtained if possible because it's going to help you improve the outcome of the emergency. It's going to help you devise specific treatments as well. And it's going to help you prevent recurrences of the same issue. Overall, I think you should expect a lower success rate than for mammalian patients, just because of the challenges of birds, because of their size, their high metabolism. So you should expect lower success. So what you need to know, and that's what I'm going to be covering here briefly. So first, emergency stabilization and supportive care. How to do a basic workup, what you need to do, so blood work, radiograph, and basically you need diagnosis to go beyond just emergency stabilization. And I'm going to be covering some common emergency presentations, such as trauma, egg binding, or seizures, or dyspnea. So what do you need to make it through the first few days? First, you need to minimize stress because birds are highly stressed animals. They have, again, a fairly high metabolism. They're very susceptible to stress-related illnesses and side effects. You need to provide supplemental heat, oxygen, fluid, You need to give some antibiotics. It doesn't have to be petrol, it can be another antibiotic. Pain management, nutritional support, and most of all, you need a diagnosis. If you don't have a diagnosis, it's going to be difficult to have a good outcome in the long term. So first, it starts by good history. So in order to be efficient and to be fast, at the hospital here, we use standardized history form, and also because we work with different people, students, interns, and clinicians. So basically, there's some question on the general information of the animal, on the husbandry, on the diet, on the past medical history. I always put a question on if there's any past reproductive history, because it's very relevant to emergency in particular, because reproductive diseases are so common in pet birds. And then I usually have a question on each of the different, on all the different systems, like the GI, the respiratory system, and so on. Patient handling is kind of important as well. You should try to minimize the time you handle the patient. We usually start by a distant examination, and a lot can be learned from that, from just looking at the feces, looking at the respiratory pattern of the bird, just looking at the body, if there's an abdominal distension. There's a lot of clinical information, very relevant information that can be obtained just by looking carefully at the bird, at the feces, even at the cage setting that the bird is in when the owner is bringing it to the hospital. The completeness of the physical exam depends on the severity of the disease. Obviously, sometimes you need to stage what you're doing. Physical examination can be broken up in different stages, as well as the sample collection. Because some birds that are highly stressed or highly dyspneic, they would not handle like very prolonged restraint. So do not do too much too early. You just need to work around that issue. It's always a good idea to pre-oxygenate the patient and warm it up. And pre-oxygenation, you can keep high partial pressure of oxygen in the blood for like 10-15 minutes. So it's always a good idea to do that. So since you want to minimize the time of handling, everything should be ready. Everything should be ready to draw blood, to perform physical examination, to take culture sample. Or if you want to look in the mouth, you need a speculum. So everything should be lined up so it can be efficient, fast, and put the bird back in the oxygen cage / incubator as soon as possible. Physical examination, obviously, before taking samples. I mean, it's nice to do a good physical examination, so I'm not going to delve too much into the physical examination and how to do it because it's fairly straightforward. But you need to get the weight, to have a good idea of the body condition. Look at the head, with the eyes, the nasal cavities, the ears. I like to palpate the crop and the entire bird body, but the crop in particular because it's fairly important if you want to anesthetize the bird. It needs to be empty so they don't regurgitate on you. Some baby birds may have foreign bodies in their crop as well that you can palpate. Then you palpate wings, legs. The abdomen, the coelomic palpation, it's kind of less sensitive than in dogs and cats, but you can still pick up big masses or abdominal distension or things like that. Then you look at the cloaca, your epidural gland, and you perform the cardiac and pulmonary auscultation as you would in a dog or cat. So first, here we start by giving heat. So why do we provide supplemental heat to birds? First, because they have an extremely high body temperature, so it can be as high as 42 degrees, but usually it's more around 39 to 41 degrees. So you want to reverse hypothermia if it's happening, and also because parrots are tropical species, so even when they're sick, they may benefit from being in a more tropical type environment. You also want to decrease the energy requirement for the bird. I mean, it's been estimated that thermogenesis in some birds can account for as high as 70% of the total energy expenditure. So it's fairly important to minimize that. And by minimizing the amount of energy spent on thermogenesis, you're going to minimize the amount of nutritional support you need to give to the bird. And it's also going to help control the weight in a hospital if you keep the bird for several days. So how does it work? So there's a thermal neutrality zone that you need to achieve. It's usually around 30, 35 degrees. So within that zone, birds do not spend any energy in thermogenesis. Their core body temperature and the thermogenesis is completely independent on the environmental temperature. So they are more or less at their basal metabolism. So you can achieve that using incubators, or if you don't have an incubator, you can use heat lamps. I mean, that's also a good alternative in practice. You need to be careful not to put the incubator too high because you could promote higher fever as well, and higher fever is linked to worse outcome. So you need to be careful. It's always a good idea to supplement humidity as well. I mean, there are tropical or subtropical species, so 60% humidity, it's a good idea. Also, some bird respiratory systems are adapted to such a high humidity, and they do better with that. Just keep in mind that tropical species, most parrots are tropical species. So those are the types of incubator we have at the hospital. They are actually fairly cheap. So you can look them up on this website in Lion, USA. They're not very expensive. They're fairly good, and they are long-lasting. They're made of metal. You can actually stack them as well. So you can stack like 3, 4 of them in the same area. Then we usually combine heat and oxygen. So why do we provide oxygen? Because birds have high basal requirements. They consume a lot of oxygen, and increased metabolism is associated with an increased oxygen demand. Also, respiratory disease, extra respiratory disease with respiratory signs, and chronic anemia are very common in pet birds presented as emergency. And it's also, as I said earlier, a good idea to pre-oxygenate your bird before handling. In clinics, you can provide higher oxygen using flow-by. You can reach like 25-45% by face mask and oxygen cages. So typically, we use oxygen cages because it's a hands-off procedure, so you don't have to restrain the bird. And you can reach concentration as high as 40-60% in there. But you need to test your incubator because all the incubators are not created equal. So you need to make sure you have a good oxygen concentration in there. So you can test that using an oxygen probe. So it's important to monitor the response to therapy as well. It depends on the disease. It also depends on the ventilation-perfusion mismatch. It's not as practical to monitor as it is in dogs and cats because the saturation is hard to take, and actually most of the pulse oximeters are not calibrated for use in birds. The partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries is hard to measure because you need arterial blood gas. So it's mainly monitored in clinics by clinical science. But basically, most patients with acute respiratory distress and signs of hypoxia would benefit from oxygen therapy regardless of the etiology. It seems to be highly, I mean, it's kind of subjective, but it seems to be highly effective in birds, probably because they have a higher ability to absorb oxygen. Their pulmonary system is way more effective. But also that makes birds more susceptible to oxygen-related toxicity. So it's not a good idea to keep birds in higher than 80% oxygen environment. And within 24 hours, they can develop severe pulmonary changes. But usually, you don't really give that high of oxygen concentration anyway. It's more towards 40-60%. So it's not going to be a big issue in clinics. So that's the type of oxygen cages you can have. So this one is an incubator / oxygen cage. And this one is an induction chamber made of an aquarium. So it's actually fairly easy to get. This one is slightly more expensive, but I don't think it's that expensive. Probably like $1,500 or something like that. But it's a fairly good incubator. And you can reach 60% oxygen in there. Then do you have any question about heat or oxygen or things like that for now? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the fluid therapy part. So I kind of spent more time dealing with that because I think it's probably the most important thing. And it's very hard to mess up oxygen and heat because it's fairly easy to implement. But fluid therapy is a little bit more difficult. It's basically the same as in dogs and cats, except that there are some practical differences in birds because of their size and because of some of the physiological differences that they have. But basically, as in small animals, you need to estimate the degree of dehydration and hypovolemia, and you need to devise a fluid therapy protocol. So you need to decide of the route that you're going to use, the fluid that you're going to use. Then you need to calculate the rate. It's going to be based on maintenance, deficit, estimation of the deficit, and anticipated loss, such as diarrhea or dyspnea. There's an increase water evaporation. Then you need to consider the acid base and electrolyte and metabolic disturbances that need to be corrected, and treat the underlying condition that is the cause of all of that. I mean, it's basically getting a diagnosis, basically. So there's a few physiological differences that may have some clinical implication in birds. First, birds do not secrete that much urea, and most of the end product of the protein catabolism is uric acid. And uric acid is not eliminated the same way as the urea, so that's a huge difference. Uric acid is eliminated by tubular secretion versus urea is eliminated by glomerular filtration. In practice, that means that birds do not need to keep a constant glomerular filtration rate because they can still eliminate the uric acid using tubular secretion. So actually, birds will increase their osmolality in response to dehydration, and they would decrease the glomerular filtration rate in response to dehydration, so they can modulate that quite a bit. Also, the kidney is not the only organ responsible for osmoregulation. The colon and coprodeum, part of the cloaca, have huge effects on it, and they participate in the post-renal handling of urine. So it's very important to realize as well. So if a bird has a GI disease, it's going to lose more fluid than you would expect because it's part of the overall osmoregulation process in those species. Also, birds have a renal portal system, and a lot of things have been said on this system, but overall, the goal of this system is to maintain tubular perfusion when the glomerular filtration rate is decreased. So basically, they can still eliminate uric acid. That's one of the explanations. So how do you estimate dehydration? It's more or less the same as in dogs and cats, except that we don't use skin fold, skin elasticity that much, except over the keel. You can look at the conjunctiva, if it's dry or if it's kind of sticky. The ulnar vein refilling time is more of endpoint of volemia than of dehydration, but they're interrelated. Mucus strength in the oral cavity, it's a good sign as well because the mucus gets stickier. Heart rate, I mean, there's an increased heart rate with dehydration and hypovolemia in response to the fluid deficit. And then you have a whole array of biochemistry changes that can happen. The PCV and total solid can increase. The urea actually can increase quite a bit in birds with pre-renal azotemia, so it's a very good marker of dehydration in birds, but it's not very useful for anything else. So that's why it's part of our panel here at the Animal Health Lab. Uric acid will increase only with severe dehydration because remember it's eliminated by tubular secretion, so you need a fairly severe dehydration to impair the excretion of uric acid. And osmolality and electrolytes are very good indicators as well because birds increase their osmolality in response to dehydration, so their osmolality is going to be increased as well. So basically, I mean, those are rules of thumb. 5% dehydration is subclinical dehydration. We assume that most birds that are presented for emergency are at least 5% dehydrated just because of the disease process, but also because they've not been drinking, probably for the past few days or few hours. 8% would show up as dry skin or dry mucous membranes. And 10-12%, you may have extreme lethargy or neurological signs, and it's more severe, basically. And I mean, basically, it's all those signs. They get more severe as the dehydration gets worse. So there's different routes that can be used. There are different types of fluids and sites and different advantages and disadvantages of those different routes. So basically, you can use subcutaneous, intravenous, and intraosseous. The subcutaneous route is used for mild dehydration, because when the dehydration is severe enough, then you have a peripheral vasoconstriction, so the fluids are not going to be very well absorbed, and they're not going to be very well redistributed to the other tissues as well, so it's not a very good route for moderate to severe dehydration. We typically use the inguinal web or interscapular area, and the volume that you can infuse under the skin is limited. I mean, birds have very tight skin. So the rule of thumb here is 10 to 15 mils per kilo per site. And you can only infuse isotonic or hypotonic fluid, so it gets absorbed by the bird. If it's hypertonic, it's just going to sit there. And you can give obviously colloid or blood products through this route. Intravenous, you can use the ulnar vein, which is on the wing, the medial metatarsal vein, or the jugular vein. Advantage is that you have an IV access for other drugs, so it's good also for emergency. You can give intravascular fluid, so there's a better redistribution of fluid to all the different tissues, so the rehydration is faster and better. And the dose can be more precise as well, and you can correct better the electrolyte and acid-base imbalances that can occur. The disadvantages are that birds don't really tolerate those types of catheters very well, so they need to be fairly moribund or moderately sick at least to have that. When they're healthy, it's very hard to keep a catheter in place. And a significant bleeding can occur if the bird takes it off. So you just need to weigh the pros and cons depending on your case. So it's not a good idea to place an IV catheter for mild dehydration because the cons are just heavier than the pros. And you can infuse like all types of fluids through that. The IO route is basically the same. We use the ulnar bone or the tibiotarsal bone. It's pretty much the same as the IV routes, except that it's a little bit harder to infuse hypertonic fluids because it seems to be painful. Also, the bone does not expand very well, so you may have fluid extravasation with high volume infusion. The good thing about IO catheter that if the bird removes it, then nothing really happens. There's no bleeding. So if you cannot really monitor your bird very well overnight, IO catheter is a very safe alternative to IV fluids. And you can use IO catheter on all types of birds, even if they are very tiny, such as canaries or budgies. You can still use IO catheter because you don't need to see the vein to give it. So that's basically the technique. So this is a skeleton of a pigeon with the keel, the head is toward here. And this is the dorsal aspect of the wing of a cockatoo. So this is the radius, ulna, carpometacarpus, and femur. So the site, the entry point for the intraosseous catheter that I prefer is the ulna. And it's right here. So there's a little condyle on the ulna, and it's just ventral to that. So you basically put the bird in dorsal recumbency, and you can prep this area and plug this area, and that's where I put the IO catheter. I don't use any sedation. I mean, I can use sedation, but I don't use any anesthesia, just because I think birds, when they require IO catheter, it means that they're fairly sick, so they're probably not safe to anesthetize. So I just put their head in an anesthetic mask with oxygen. I just give oxygen, and then there's an assistant holding the bird, and you can put the IO catheter very quickly. It's a little bit painful, but I mean, I guess it's still better than death of not having fluids. So you need to weigh the pros and cons. You can actually put it very quickly. It stays in place very nicely, so you can see it's just ventral to that condyle here. It's very easy to palpate. If you want to check if you're in the right spot, because sometimes it may not be easy, like on every circumstances, you just need to look at the ulnar vein. You just inject a test bolus, and you actually see the fluid going through the vein. So that's a nice way to check it. I don't like to put IO catheter on the tibiotarsus because birds are bipedal, so when they are sick and they have to stand on that painful leg. On the wing, that doesn't really matter because they don't use them that much. And on the tibiotarsus, you cannot really check if you're in. If you have a good position, I mean, you can do it by taking an X-ray, but just clinically it's very hard to assess. So I just prefer the wing for that. So yeah, that's the site, and that's how you insert the catheter. For IV, we use the ulnar vein, so that is the ventral aspect of the wing with the humerus, and this is the ulnar, and the radius is over here. So this is the ulnar vein, which is transforming into the basilic vein. So we just put it here. Sometimes it can be quite tricky to place because those veins are very small. So I always place them with some type of surgical loops, surgical magnification. It's just way easier to do. And the medial metatarsal vein is my favorite site for placing it on a bird that is not anesthetized because you don't need to restrain the bird like brutally. You just ask an assistant to hold it, and you just take the leg and put the catheter in it. Whereas in the wing, you need to put the bird in its back. You need somebody to hold the wing, somebody else to hold the body. So it's a little bit more of a mess to do. But usually under anesthesia, we place it on the wing because the vein is more conspicuous. And by the way, you can go on this website as well, lafebervet.com. They have a lot of videos of like procedures and techniques, like how to place an IO catheter, how to place an IV catheter. They have videos of that. How to place, I think they have a video of how to place an air sac tube, so you can check that out. It's probably easier to look at a video than having a description. All the fluids should be warm. So warm means avian body temperature. So 37 degrees is cold for birds. So it needs to be at least 40, 41 degrees. Here at the hospital, we use the Exoterra reptile egg incubator. It's very cheap, and it's much cheaper than a medical grade warmer, and it does the work just fine. So it's about $300 to $400. So you can actually buy several and put them in your surgical suite. So we like it. So fluid selection, birds have higher plasma osmolality than mammals. I mean, on average, their plasma osmolality is about 300 to 320 milliosmol per kilogram. Mammals, it's about 280. It's a little bit higher in cats. So they're more like cats in this way, but a little bit higher. So you need to realize that some of the fluids that are isotonic for mammals are actually hypotonic for birds, such as lactated Wenger solution. The fluid selection also depends on the electrolyte abnormalities, acid-base abnormalities, also other metabolic disturbances that can occur. Depend on the route, so you need slightly hypotonic fluids to give subcut, but you can give any type of fluid, IV or IO. Hypertonic fluid IO are a little bit painful, so try to avoid it. The fluid selection depends on your goal. Is your goal to rehydrate the bird, or is your goal to resuscitate the bird, or to increase the volemia, to increase the intravascular space? So you need to think about that. The challenges in birds are that the clinical endpoints are limited because the blood pressure cannot be taken reliably in small to medium-sized birds, so it's more like a guess. Lactates are always very high because birds are always very stressed when you catch them, so they have very high lactates, so it's very hard to assess the perfusion this way using lactates. So it's a little bit harder to monitor like resuscitation or high rate fluid therapy in birds. So there are two types of fluids, basically the crystalloids and the colloids. So crystalloids are, you can use them IV, so I'm just going to talk about that. So IV crystalloids should be thought as interstitial rehydrators, so they don't really remain in the intravascular space for very long. I mean, all of that is the same as in small animals, but applied to birds. So it's basically a little bit the same, just with some mild differences when applying that to birds. So they will distribute very rapidly in extracellular space. Some of those crystalloids are balanced, such as LRS, normosol, or plasmalite, and some are not balanced, such as physiologic saline. Large infusion of hypotonic fluids, such as LRS, can lead to decrease in plasma osmolality and increase in cerebral water in mammals. So if it can happen in mammals, it can be even worse in birds because they have higher osmolality. So for resuscitation, I would not use LRS. I would use something with a higher osmolality, such as normosol or plasmalite. And hypertonic saline is very short-lived, and it's usually used as intravascular expander. It's very effective. I mean, it can work at 1/4 the volume of colloid. So we use it for resuscitation. So this is a table of the different crystalloid replacement fluid that can be used with the LRS, the plasmalite A, physiologic saline, and normosol. And this is a column for the period plasma. So you can see that the period plasma seems to be closer to the plasmalite A in terms of osmolality, but also in terms of pH. So they're a little bit just deficient in chloride. But that's the fluid that we use typically for IV or IO infusion, or even subcute sometimes. So we tend not to use LRS when it's IV, just because it's slightly hypotonic, or only when the fluid weight is low, we can use LRS. So, and you need to keep in mind that bird plasma osmolality is even higher when they are dehydrated. Colloids are intravascular expanders, so we basically use them like when birds seem to have a low blood pressure, or when they're hypovolemic, or under anesthesia when there's some blood loss, or when we think the blood pressure is dropping. There are two that are mainly available, etastarch and pentastarch. So the dose that we use is 5 to 10 milliliters per kilo IV, and this can be repeated at least twice. The half-life of most of those colloids is 24 hours. And there's some relative contraindication to the use of colloids, as in mammals, such as hypersensitivity to colloids, capillary leak, such as in some types of pneumonia, coagulopathy, anuric renal failure, and congestive heart failure. For resuscitation, you can combine colloids and hypertonic saline, and that's very effective, actually. It's more effective than crystalloids. So in practice, that's what we do here. So for hyperkalemia, hypercalcemia, and hyperchloremic metabolic alkalosis, we use physiologic saline. For subcute maintenance or IV for maintenance or low rate replacement therapy or metabolic acidosis, we use LRS. Or we also use plasmalite for that, replacement therapy and metabolic acidosis. We use combination of colloid and hypertonic saline for resuscitation. It's kind of hard to resuscitate birds, as I'm going to discuss. So, I mean, basically, if you want to use that mix, it needs to be already prepared, because the time you prepare it, the bird is already dead, fortunately. So, you need to have it handy. We use colloids when the blood pressure is lower, for hypoproteinemia, or low oncotic pressure, and that's the dose that we use. Some additives can be added to the fluid or can be added to the fluid treatment protocols, such as potassium chloride, dextrose 2.5, 5% in case of hypoglycemia, or bicarbonate in case of very severe metabolic acidosis, calcium gluconate in case of ionized hypocalcemia, and some CI of various drugs can be used as well. So the rate is important. The maintenance in birds is surprisingly about the same as in dogs, because they are much more efficient at conserving water. So it's about 50 to 100 ml per kg per day. We don't really know exactly what it is, because the study has not been done in such a way that we have an accurate number. And it probably varies between the species. So, I mean, depending on the species, 50 to 100 ml per kg per day. Passerine birds drink more. They drink 2 to 3 times as much. And neonates have higher maintenance as well. So baby birds, you need to increase your fluids as well. They have a higher water content of their body. The correction of dehydration can be made over 24 hours. The rate can be even higher if the dehydration is acute. I mean, if the fluid deficit has happened acutely, then the replacement can be acutely replaced. I mean, done. We usually use a syringe pump just because of the low rate that we are giving fluid at in birds. If you don't have a syringe pump or you don't want to keep a line, you can divide up the total amount of fluid during the day in 4 to 10 boluses, depending on what you want to do. So that's it for the fluids. Then there's the blood transfusion. So that's another type of fluid that contains coagulation factors, white blood cells, thrombocytes. So it's a little bit different in birds because the red blood cell lifespan is way shorter. It's like a third of the lifespan of mammals. It's only a month. And it's only worth doing it for homologous transfusion because that's the result that you get. So if you transfuse with homologous transfusion, the lifespan of the transfused red blood cells is about 10 days. If you do that with the same genus of bird but heterologous transfusion, it's about 5 days. If the bird species are still paired but completely unrelated, that can only be a few hours. So it's not really worth doing it if you don't have the same species of bird to transfuse with. You need to administer that over 4 hours, and you need to use a test bolus, as you would do in dogs and cats. And we are also limited by the amount of blood that we can take from the donor. So it's only 1% of blood that we can take from the donor, so it's a good idea to have several donors. Basically, blood transfusion, we don't use it very often just because it's very challenging to have blood donors. Then the blood donors need to be anesthetized in order to collect the blood. So we do it every now and then, but we need to find donors, so it's a little bit challenging. Pediatric filters are used, the Hemonet. So you would lose less blood in the priming of the filter than if you use like a larger filter. So the take-home message is that it's only worth doing it if you have the same species, basically. African grey parrot with an African grey parrot. 2 species of Amazon parrot is not the same species, so it's going to be a very short lifespan. So you need to do the same species of Amazon parrot and so on. So avian CPR, it's a little bit challenging. Basically, the success rate is fairly low. It's the same concept than for mammals, but the success is very low. I mean, by the time you start and you're like, what I'm going to do with this bird is already dead. So it's like their metabolism so fast that it's very challenging. There's a higher success rate when the bird's already anesthetized and already has a catheter, is already intubated, because you can just infuse fluid and start like bagging and decrease the ISO or things like that. So it's basically, I mean, the success rate is probably like 0 to 0.5%, so it's like very low. So yeah, don't worry if you don't have very good results. But birds, with that said, birds are much more resistant to shock. I mean, they need to lose like close to 60% of their blood volume to run into a decompensated shock. Clinical endpoints, as I said earlier, are of low value. Cardiac compression is not possible because you have the keel that is really a shield to the heart. So I mean, there's no way you can compress the heart because the keel is all the way there with the coracoid. You're not gonna be able to compress the heart. So I mean, I still do it, so I have a peace of mind, but it doesn't work. Fluids, as I said earlier, you can use a combination of crystalloid and colloid. So you have very fast intravascular expansion to increase the volemia and the perfusion. And you can use some drug, but by the time you use the drug, it's probably already dead, but it's worth trying. Nutritional support. So most of the birds that come as emergency are in negative energy balance. Because there's an increased metabolic cost of being sick. The immune system is activated. The metabolism can increase by 20% with fever. It has actually been documented in birds. There are certain states of disease that increase your metabolism, such as seizures or respiratory efforts. Most birds are anorexic or inappetent or decreased food intake. Our problems are very often chronic because owners they take a long time to recognize that the bird is sick, and then it takes a longer time to go to the vet. So when you add all that together, it can be a very long time. Birds have a lot of nutritional deficiencies if they're on seeds. So it's always, even if the bird is still eating, if the bird is on seed and sick, we usually force feed it for a few days because there are a lot of vitamins in the hen feeding formula, a lot of electrolytes and proteins and all of that. And there's some physiological implication of starvation. There's a metabolism shift to our use of fat or muscle. So you need to counteract that as well. So there's two methods, the NICE and the surgical method. So the first method is just to tube feed the bird like every so often that you can meet the metabolic requirements. And the second method is to implant a pharyngostomy tube. So we usually use the second method when the bird is very sick, when it's kind of difficult to force feed, like big trauma or anything happening on the face, or when the feeding are very frequent in order to maintain the body weight, or when the bird is kept for a very long time in hospital, so that kind of minimizes the stress. We do that quite a bit in raptors because they are more stressed out than the pet animals that have had more interaction with people. Nutritional requirement, it's always a good idea to calculate them so you know if you're able to meet them, to meet the metabolic requirements. So usually you have this formula, the basal metabolic rate, which is a constant times the weight in kilogram to the power 0.67. So in mammals, it tends to be the power here tends to be 0.75. So in birds, a little bit lower, meaning that they have higher metabolism. So we use the constant 129 in passerine, 79 for non-passerine. Then that's the basal metabolic rate. That means that the bird is basically not using any energy to digest or to breathe. So you need to add a little bit more energy for the bird to be able to sustain basic like physiological function. So it's about 1.25, 1.5, the basal metabolic rate. And then you multiply that by another constant depending on the status of the bird, if he's starved, if he has a severe trauma, or if he's septic. And there's a bunch of nutritional formula that you can use. Some are made specifically for force feeding of critical cases, such as MRI products or high risk and recovery. Or some are just cytosine hand feeding formula that you can use. They're actually cheaper and they work very well. I mean, if you can raise very tiny baby parrots into adults in 2 months, I think you can use that for critical care of adult birds. So we actually use hand feeding formula because they work very well. So there's so much you can give at every feeding that it's about the rule of thumb that we use about 30 milliliters per kilogram, which is about the estimated crop volume. So you need to divide the total amount of nutritional formula into the different feedings. So it needs to be divided up. You need to know the caloric density of the food after reconstitution. So usually the caloric density of the food is written on the bag, but then you need to reconstitute it, so you can divide that by at least 3. Some hand feeding formula may significantly swell up after you put water in it. So actually some of the formula you need to add more water, so you need to select a formula that is the best in terms of going through a syringe. And we usually administer that using a ball-tip metallic cannula that you can buy on some veterinary webpage. The esophagus is curving a little bit to the right, so we go from left to right to give that. It's also a good idea to have a variety of food available for birds, because it's not, when the bird is sick, it's not the good time to switch the diet. I mean, if he's on seeds, you're just gonna eat seeds in the hospital. If he's very sick, it's just not the right time to switch the diet. The birds if they eat a specific brand of pellets, they're very hard to switch to another brand. So it's a good idea to have like just a variety of food. So we have a lot of different types of food in hospitals, so we can meet like what they like when they're hospitalized. Do you have any questions on fluids and nutritional requirements or basic stabilization of birds, or any experience that you want to share?
Is there any maximum diameter of the IO catheter?
Maximum, I guess it depends. So the question was if there was a maximum diameter of spinal needle or IO catheter you could use. And the answer is not. I mean, I guess there's a maximum diameter. I mean, it shouldn't be bigger than the bone, but that's the maximum diameter. But usually we use a 22 gauge, 1.5 inch spinal needle. It seems to work best for a variety of species, at least for the medium-sized parrot that we see, which usually weigh from 300 to 500 grams. For smaller birds, such as cockatiels, we use 25 gauge needles. For smaller birds than cockatiel, we use 26 gauge needle. For bigger birds, we use 20 gauge spinal needles. Usually with 20 gauge spinal needles, 22 gauge spinal needles, you can cover like most of the birds you're gonna see, and 25 needles, injection needles. Okay, let's move on to the drugs. So we love giving drugs to birds, and antibiotics is probably some of the drugs that are the most commonly administered to birds. With that said, it should follow species-specific pharmacokinetic studies. So it's better to use antibiotics that we have data on than antibiotics that we don't have data on. It should be based on culture and sensitivity, but it's not always practical, especially when the bird is just presented sick and you need to start a broad-spectrum antibiotic. The antibiotic choice depends on the site and on the common bacterial pathogen that you're going to encounter on this site. So on the skin, it's more gram-positive, for instance. For dyspnea, pneumonia, ursaculitis, probably going to be more gram-negative, and so on. For some of the diseases, probably going to be more anaerobic bacteria. For bite wounds by cat, it's going to be more anaerobic bacteria and Pasteurella species. So you just need to adapt your antibiotic therapy on the presumed bacterial species that are there. But the rule of thumb that we use for like initial antibiotic therapy are those. For mild disease, we use trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, or amoxicillin clavulanic acid, or fluoxetine oral. When the bird is a little bit more debilitated, we use injectable antibiotics. So Betrol is very irritative to tissue, but you can still administer it subcute in a fluid pocket. You can also use piperacillin. It needs to be administered very frequently. Most of the antibiotics, injectable antibiotics, need to be administered very frequently, at least 3 to 4 times a day if you want like a very good effect, if the bird is septic or there's an infection to be taken care of. For sepsis, usually we give IV. I mean, the way it needs to be widely distributed in the tissue. You need to achieve the minimum inhibitory concentration very fast in the blood, so we use IV. I usually use a combination of cephalosporin, such as cefotaxime, ceftazidime, and amikacin IV, 3 to 6 times a day, and usually the amikacin only once a day, so you minimize the renal side effects. Cefovecin does not work in birds, so it's not long-lasting in birds as it is in mammals. It lasts for a few hours. For some of the intracellular bacteria, such as Chlamydia psittaci, you need to use other types of antibiotics, such as doxycycline or azithromycin. Enrofloxacin can work sometimes, at least to improve some of the clinical signs of avian chlamydiosis. Analgesia, it's a little bit complicated as well in the analgesia because it depends on the species of birds. But basically, we use butorphanol 1 to 5 milligrams per kilogram. It's a little bit higher in parrots, a little bit lower in birds of prey. Some psittacine birds require a very high dose of butorphanol, such as Amazon parrots, so 4 to 5 mg per kg in Amazon parrots. Some psittacine species seem to respond better to hydromorphone, such as cockatiels. I don't know if it's true for the other cockatoos, but there's been a study on cockatiels at least, and it suggests that hydromorphone is better in them. For falcons, buprenorphine and hydromorphone seem to be better, but we don't know for other birds of prey such as hawks, which are unrelated to falcons. So maybe mu or kappa agonists are more effective. For non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, we use meloxicam. I mean, there's no reason to use something else because there's so much data on meloxicam that I think it's just the best NSAID to use in birds. It seems to be very safe, very low toxicity. There are a lot of pharmacokinetic data and analgesimetry data. So 0.5 to 1.5 milligram per kilo, once to twice a day seems to be good enough. Tramadol, if you want to use more of a multimodal approach or if you want to minimize side effects of pain medication, you can use tramadol. except that the dose is very high in birds. There's only one study in Amazon Perros, and the dose is so high that it makes it impractical in terms of volume administration. So we still use it when we gavage feed birds, but we tend not to use it after or at a lower dose. But in birds of prey, seems to be okay. So that's one of the big take-home message of the day as well. Do not use steroid in birds. They are corticosensitive species. There's really no reason whatsoever to use corticosteroids in emergency basis. Or there's still some indication, but they're very rare, and you really need to diagnose it before using them. Birds will develop UPD that can be fairly severe. They can develop some fairly severe infections, such as aspergillosis. Steroid, regardless of the disease and the indication, steroid ointment should never be used. I mean, we've seen some fairly bad diabetes mellitus, or it's just there's a very long-lasting effect of steroid ointment in birds, and it seems to be very deleterious to their health. So don't use steroid, please. And there's a lasting suppression of the pituitary hypothalamo axis. If you want to use it in some indications, such as like egg binding or oviductal torsion, and there's a lot of fluid accumulation. Sometimes it helps reducing the fluid, but we still use it at very low dose, so anti-inflammatory dose, 0.1 or even lower mg per kg once or twice a day, or dexamethasone at 0.02 mg per kg. Nebulization can be used as well for respiratory disease. The particle size, though, should be smaller than the parabronchi. So most parabronchi, the smallest parabronchi in birds are about 0.3 micrometer, but it depends on the bird species. Some birds have huge parabronchi. Nebulizers are cheap. They're about $50, $60. So they're ultrasonic nebulizer. That's the brand that you can find easily on the market. It's called PARI, P-A-R-I. They're very cheap. I don't use a lot of mucolytic agents because they're very irritative to the tracheal mucosa, so I don't think they're very useful. But some of the antibiotics that you can use are amikacin and rofloxacin, or some of the antifungals such as voriconazole, which is fairly expensive, or amphotericin B, which is also fairly expensive. Bronchodilator, if you think there's bronchoconstriction happening, such as terbutaline or other types of bronchodilators. A lot of the birds on bad diet have vitamin deficiencies, but if you force feed them with hand feeding formula, actually all the vitamins are in there, so they don't really need additional vitamins, except if you suspect a very specific hypovitaminosis, such as hypovitaminosis A or bleeding tendency, then you can supplement with specific vitamins. We tend not to do it if we force feed them, because there's a lot of vitamins in there, in the hand feeding mix. So I'm just going to give you a quick example to sum it up. So this is Jean-Pierre, the cockatoo, 300-gram cockatoo, so medium size, small cockatoo. Was presented for acute lethargy, anorexia, polyuria, diarrhea, so basically wet stools. We performed a brief physical examination because it didn't seem very stable, and it was a little bit on the sicker side. The dehydration was estimated at about 8%. So we placed him right away in an incubator 30 degrees with 40% oxygen for 15 minutes to pre-oxygenate him. Then we took him out and took some blood. So it's amazing what you can do with very small volume with only 2 milliliters. I mean, the higher sample size, sample volume you can take on this bird is about 3 milliliters. So we tend to take less when they're very sick, so about 2 milliliters. You can still do a complete CBC, blood gas, biochemistry, and blood culture with that. So, I mean, you just need to maximize what you do with your sample. So, blood gas, I mean, in practice, you can perform blood gas. There's the iStat. It's a portable machine. It's fairly expensive, but you can do blood gas, and it requires very tiny amount of blood. Here we have a bigger machine, but in practice you can use the iStat. So he had a hyperchloremic normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, so pH of 7.1, low bicarb, high sodium and chloride, and slightly higher osmolality. It had a heterophilic leukocytosis with toxic heterophytes, a slightly lower PCV, knowing that it's dehydrated, low blood glucose, so a little bit hypoglycemic. So the glycemia in bird is twice as high as mammals, so 10 to 20 millimole per liter. Uric acid was a little bit increased, so maybe the dehydration, maybe some renal component. And on the blood culture that we obtained later, Staphylococcus aureus was cultured from both the blood and the cloaca. So basically, there's some acid-base metabolic and electrolytic and metabolic disturbances. So since the bird is fairly small, we decided to place an IO catheter that was secured with a figure-8 bandage. We elected to use plasmalite A because the fluid weight is going to be high, that we supplemented in potassium chloride, that we supplemented in dextrose. So knowing that the bird is fairly sick, has some types of diarrhea, polyuria, is hypoglycemic, our working diagnosis was sepsis, probably due to gastroenteritis or gram-negative infection. So the maintenance for this bird about 15 milliliters per day. The fluid deficit is about 24 milliliters. So that makes a continuous rate of 1.6 milliliters per hour if you want to correct the entire dehydration within 24 hours. If you don't want to leave an IV line, you can divide it up in several boluses. So for instance, 5 boluses of 8 milliliters over 24 hours. If you choose to do boluses, you need to be very careful with the potassium rate, because if you supplement with potassium and you give a bolus with a potassium weight higher than 0.5 milliequivalent per kilogram per hour, you can have some cardiac conduction abnormalities. So be very careful if you use boluses. We gave some piperacillin intraosseous 4 times a day, and we also gave some butorphanol for pain management. In terms of the nutritional plan, the body condition was okay, but we didn't want the bird to lose weight, and we wanted the bird to have enough calorie to work around this disease. So we used the Hagen tropical hand feeding formula that has a caloric density of about 4.6 kilocalories per gram. So if you divide by 3, because you need to reconstitute with water, it makes 1.5 kilocalories per milliliter. So the minimum energy requirement of this bird is about 52.2 kilocalories. You need to multiply that by a factor because the bird is septic, so it's about 78.3 kilocalories. Then you divide the formula into different feedings to be able to give it over 24 hours. So it's divided by 1.5, which is the caloric density of the food. That gives you 52 milliliters and 6 feeding. So you can see that it's a lot of feeding for little bird, a lot of handling. So it's actually hard for a bird that is not eating, it's very hard to maintain its weight because their metabolism is just too high and just too complicated to catch the animals so often. So practically, we just force feed them 2 to 3 times a day, and then we monitor the weight. And if it's really a problem, we either force feed them often or higher volume, or we place a pharyngostomy tube. We also added some oral antibiotics. Since you're force feeding, I mean, you can put a whole bunch of medication in the mix. It's very easy to give. And our presumed diagnosis was sepsis with a bacterial enteritis. We performed radiographs under anesthesia when the bird was more stable, and we saw some gas in the GI. So we monitored the blood work, etc. So it was sent home 3 days later only with all antibiotics and lived happily ever after as far as we are concerned. So basically, I mean, it's a bird, it's a very tiny animal, 300 grams. I mean, it's very tiny, but in a bird like that, you can still do great medicine, you can still measure blood gas, you can still do blood culture, you can still do a meaningful fluid replacement therapy protocol, you can still calculate energy requirement. You can do a lot in those animals. I mean, the avian medicine has evolved and has made tremendous progress over the past 20 years. So you really need to practice basically the same type of medicine as you would do in any patient. Any question on that? Yes?
When you're mixing your hand feeding formula, it's 1 to 3 with water?
Yes.
You
You can that if you want. Yeah, we typically don't, but yeah, you can. So remember, in order to improve your outcome, you really need a diagnosis. It's not enough to stabilize the animal. If you want the animal to survive, you need to treat what caused the animal to be sick in the first place. So that means performing diagnostic tests. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for you to reach a diagnosis with just the physical examination and the history. So it's not an excuse that the animal is too small or that it's too dangerous, it has too big of a beak or talons, or that birds are too fragile. They're actually fairly tough. I mean, for their size, they are fairly tough animals. The lack of knowledge and comfort is not an excuse as well. I mean, there are a lot of resources now, and I think you can just look it up easily or read about avian medicine or refer or ask for advice. It's very easy to do, and they're very different from mammals, so obviously there's a steep learning curve to learning avian medicine, but it's very interesting and rewarding. You need to learn from your mistakes as well. So if an animal does not make it, I mean, it's still a valuable teaching tool. So post-mortem examination, it's very useful, but it's not enough. I mean, I cannot count the number of like histopathologic diagnoses that we were not suspecting at all on the post-mortem examination. So you really need to do histopathology in order to find what made the bird sick. So if the patient is stable enough, you should do the blood work before you do anything, because everything you're going to do is going to change. I mean, it's a living organism that is constantly changing and adapting. So you need to do everything before you administer any treatment or do anything. Injection, stress, handling is going to increase your CK, AST, LDH, and they can be increased for up to 5 days. It's going to increase your white blood cell count if you inject injections, antibiotic that is kind of irritative, like petrol or doxycycline. Your lymphocytes can decrease because the bird is stressed. Nutritional support is going to increase mildly your bile acid if you take the blood after because they are digesting. It can increase your uric acid in raptors as well. Chlamydia PCR can lead to false negative if you already started the treatment with doxycycline and ofloxacin. It's the same for culture. If you already started antibiotics, your culture can be a false negative. PCV, total solid electrolytes, can change with fluid therapy very quickly. So just think about that. Sometimes it's not always possible if the animal is very sick or if there's no money in the budget to do those diagnostic tests. But if you want to take blood, it's better to do it before than after an injection, for instance. So basically, you need to do what you've been doing with the other animals. You need some basic history and physical examination, some basic workup, CBC, biochemistry, PCR, titers, whole body weight graph. You need to be able to interpret them. And it's not as easy as you would think. I mean, the blood work is not interpreted the same way as you would in small mammals or in mammals. So you need to learn how to interpret the blood work or the weight graph, the radiographic anatomy. Then you have a working diagnosis and a list of differential diagnoses. But the only way to confirm a diagnosis is to perform cytology, histopathology, or paired rising titers. There's really no other way to have a confirmed diagnosis. So try to get biopsy, cytology if you can, if the case is amenable to it. The complete blood count, you can take a maximum volume of 1% of the body weight. So in cockatiels, about 0.9 to 1 milliliter. So you can still do a lot with that volume. All hematologic techniques are manual in birds. So there's no machine that is accurate so far. If there's a company that tells you it's accurate, it's probably not. They're just trying to sell you the machine. The minimum database in an emergency is PCV, total solid, and white blood cell estimation from the smear or leucopet. So you don't need to send that to a lab to do that. You can still do that in your practice. PCV, total solid, it's very easy. It gives you a lot of information. White blood cell estimation, it's easy to do with a microscope. Leucopet are fairly cheap. They have been used for years in birds. So basically, I put some highlights, some of the findings that are very common. Anemia of chronic disease is very common because the metabolism is so quick. The lifespan of white blood cell is so short that they develop anemia of chronic disease very, very quickly. Birds also have tremendous white blood cell count response to inflammation. The morphology of cells is important if there's some toxicity in the heterophiles. You need to select clinical pathologies that are good with birds because they are not the same, they're not as good, they're not all the same. And you need to submit the CBC with blood smears, especially if it's going to be interpreted like a day or two later. The plasma biochemistry, I'm not going to delve too much into that because it can take an entire talk. But basically, I mean, at the Animal Health Laboratory, we work very hard to make a very complete panel. So we have 22 analytes that can use very tiny amount of blood, probably like 0.2 or 0.3 cc of plasma. So there are a lot of different analytes for the liver, kidneys, pancreas, electrolyte, and other analytes. So it's very comprehensive, and I don't think there's any other panel that is more comprehensive than this one. In comparison, the VETScan has 9 parameters. The VETScan is still fairly good because you can perform a whole biochemistry on only 0.15 milliliter of whole blood. So it's still fairly handy in clinics, and you can have the result very, very fast. But it does not seem to be very reliable for electrolytes, sodium and chloride and potassium. I guess the chloride is not on the panel, but for sodium and potassium. Radiographs, they need to be straight, so just make sure you have the kill superimposed with the vertebral column, and on the lateral, the acetabular superimposed as well as the coracoids. So it's important to obtain radiographs because there are a lot of findings that you can have on those that can help you reach a diagnosis faster. There are some other useful tests, chlamydia testing, avian-borne virus testing, Cetacean circovirus testing in some of the some species, bacterial culture, fecal cytology, heavy metal, histopathology, and they don't cost you anything because you don't need to invest in equipment to perform them. The coelomic ultrasound, cardiac ultrasound, diagnostic endoscopy, obviously you need to invest in the equipment, but they're very useful. I mean, coelomic ultrasound to detect fluid, coelomic fluid or pericardial fluid or masses, intracoelomic masses. Cardiac ultrasound is actually fairly easy in birds. You can just quickly check the volume of the chambers, just in case you have a congestive heart failure. Diagnostic endoscopy, there's a little bit more of a learning curve there, but it's really the ultimate diagnostic test in burn because you can take targeted biopsy on the lesion of virtually every organ just by making a 3 millimeter puncture hole. So it's very useful in birds. You need to prioritize the different tests you're gonna do because you're gonna have probably some lack of funds or the bird is small or the bird is very sick, so you won't results right away. So usually we start by blood work and radiograph. Some tests are not that useful. Protein electrophoresis, we don't really use it because it's more of a tool for population assessment if you want to screen for disease. So the specificity is so low that it's not really useful for the individual clinical case. Blood aspergillosis testing are fairly useless in my opinion, because the sensitivity and specificity are so low that the overall accuracy is about 50-60%. So you have like 50% chance of having a positive. And it depends on the prevalence as well, so we don't really use them. We prefer to confirm the diagnosis by biopsy or cytology of the lesion. A fecal gram stain, it depends on the diet, so we don't use it except to screen for candida. It's fairly useful for candida, yeast infection. But in my opinion, just to look at bacteria, I mean, it's better to get bacterial culture and see what type of bacteria you have in there. But it depends on the diet. I mean, if the bird is eating seeds, it's going to be gram negative. If he's eating pellets, it's going to be gram positive. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Crop culture with the GI sign, gastrointestinal signs, it's going to be very hard to interpret. A lot of the bacteria can be transient in the GI. Exploratory laparotomy, it's a diagnostic test that is commonly used in mammals. While in birds, it's a little bit difficult because their respiratory system is so extensive. So we use cilioscopy instead. PCR, like there's some respiratory and health awareness panels out there for birds. Most of the disease in those panels do not actually occur in pet birds. And for the disease that occur in pet bird, the PCR is not sensitive for those, so you can forget about those. Box radiographs, they're only useful for metal screening or if you want to screen for the presence of an egg. But they're not very useful because the position is not good. You have a lot of superimposition of organs, so they're going to be very difficult to interpret. So it's better you can just do it if you're suspecting metal or an egg and you just want to confirm it, but it's probably better to wait and do like a proper position radiograph. So just some of my thoughts on that. So then I'm just gonna discuss some of the classical presentation of some of the emergencies. Do you have any question on diagnostic testing and emergency stabilization of birds, pet birds or birds of prey? Or any experience or stuff you always wanted to know about birds? So trauma, very common. Animal attack, it can be another pet bird. They can be quite mean when they don't like the cage mate. So crushing big trauma are actually more serious than what you think. The birds can be quite normal, but they can become septic a few days later, or they can become in shock a few days later. So I would keep them in hospital for 2 to 3 days just to keep an eye on them, even if they look good. Although there's something happening in there, maybe they release a lot of vasoactive amines, and it takes some time to become in shock, or it takes 2 to 3 days for the local bacteria to adapt to the system and spread to the other organs. Leg amputation, wing amputation by raccoons is actually fairly common. Some of the birds are kept in like garage, and raccoons are fairly smart creatures. So they would pull legs and wings. So it's fairly nasty, but the bird, it's fairly impressive when they come in, but don't anesthetize the bird right away. The bird needs to be stabilized, so it needs an IV catheter, some antibiotics. You can clean the wound very quickly and put some wet to dry bandage or some types of ointment on it. If you anesthetize right away to amputate or to debride, there's a very good chance it's going to die because it's not stable, it's in shock. So I actually prefer to stabilize them for a few hours before I anesthetize them to amputate. I think the outcome is better. Overall, the outcome is not that great because there are a lot of them, they become septic or they're in hypovolemic shock. But I like to wait a few hours. Big fractures are fairly common. The treatment depends on the area of the fracture. If it happens on the rhinotheca, on the upper beak, on the lower beak, usually you leave it open and you just treat locally. And then when the infection is gone, you can cover with acrylic. The tip of the beak can bleed quite heavily, and usually the only thing that works to stop the bleeding is heat, cauterization with heat. Fracture of the mandibular symphysis can be repaired using cerclage wire. Avulsion of the beak, there's no way to repair it. You can try, it's not going to work. You need to amputate that part of the beak. The forces are just great. That beak can break stainless steel wires, so it's not a little plate you're going to put on the side that's going to work. So you need to amputate the beak at that level. You can actually close the skin here. They just do fine with that. Sometimes they may need a few days of gavage feeding to be able to adapt. But there's some, for the upper beak, there's some orthopedic surgery that can be done, but for this area, it doesn't seem to work. And remember that some of the respiratory system is in the beak. There's a diverticulum of the infraorbital air sac here, of the infraorbital sinus, sorry. So some of the infection of the beak can spread to the entire head and can spread to the upper airway as well. So just keep that in mind. Leg band constriction is fairly common in small birds, canaries. You need a specific band cutter to cut them because they're hard to cut. So you can actually buy this one. It's a veterinary specialty product. It's a leg band cutter. It's been made for that. Just need to make sure when you cut the band that the animal is under anesthesia and that you hold the band with some type of forceps on the other side. So when you cut it, it doesn't twist and break the leg. It can happen. It can be very quick. So yeah, use anesthesia and a proper leg band cutter. Blood feathers, obviously, everybody should be familiar with this one. The blood feather should be removed. It's fairly painful, so pain medication is a good idea. In some cases, the tissue glue can be applied on the site of fracture. If it's a small fracture of the feather sheath, you can do that if you want to save the feather. If the feather is broken at the base, it's going to keep bleeding with every trauma of the wing, so it needs to be removed. So for that, the bird needs to be anesthetized, the feather follicle needs to be open, and you need to extract the remaining pulp in there. Fractures are also fairly common. So obviously you start with pain medication, supportive care. The fracture needs to be immobilized. So there's a variety of bandages you can apply. Usually figure 8 bandage is commonly used for carpo metacarpus, ulnar, radius, but it's not enough for the humerus. You need to immobilize the articulation below and above the fracture. So you need to add a body wrap on top of that. Femoral fractures cannot be immobilized. I mean, there's a lot. I guess you can put some bandages around the body of the bird, but the reality is that it doesn't really work. It's kind of hard to place, so we don't put any bandages for femoral fractures. In small birds, you don't put any bandages. You just put it in a carrier for like birds like 100 grams or less, and they just heal fine with no intervention whatsoever. Tibiotarsus, tarsometatarsus can be immobilized using modified Robert-Jones, tape splint in small birds. Digit fractures or luxation can be immobilized by taping to the adjacent toe, or you can use variety of splint. So I have some example here, how to perform a figure 8 bandage. So you're immobilizing the wrist and the elbow. For humerus fracture, you need to immobilize the wing to the body. So the shoulder articulation is immobilized as well. For small birds, there are more options because they're so small that just a little bandage is enough to counteract the muscle strength. So tape splint works well for small birds. You just need to shape it and use the appropriate angles so they don't get stuck in extension. You can use syringe case splint for larger birds to immobilize tibiotarsal fracture. For complex fracture as well, especially of the distal tarsometatarsus, like happening here, or the proximal tarsometatarsus or distal tibiotarsus, sorry, you can use acrylic dental splint, and you just shape it, mold it around the leg, and just cure it. It's a little bit of a pain to remove. You just need to Dremel it with a cutting wheel on either side. But it works very well, and it's very well tolerated by the bird. The bottom line is that the bandage needs to be light, especially on small birds. So that's why we use those types of splinting. If you want to repair it surgically, it needs to be as soon as possible. Obviously, the bird needs to be stable. But it needs to be as soon as possible. The more you wait, the more callus you're going to have, and it's incredible how much callus they can make in such a short time. That is the classic construct that we use for repairing fracture. Orthopedic surgeries in a bird is fairly easy. It's much easier in mammals because the bones are smaller. You can just use IM pins that are cheap. You don't need like plates or stuff like that. So it's actually fairly easy. You don't have a lot of soft tissue. So that's the construct we use. It's called external fixator IM pin tie-in. And there are a lot of publication and things on that. Regurgitation vomiting, it's a common presentation. So that's an example on African grey with heavy metal toxicosis. So it's just regurgitating all over the incubator. So to me, heavy metal intoxication is one of the most common causes in emergency regurgitation presentation. Goiter in budgerigar is fairly common as well. And then there's the whole diagnostic differential of common stuff you're going to see in emergency causing regurgitation. So PDD, proventricular dilation disease, seems to be fairly common in Ontario. So it's also something to think about in the susceptible species. So that's a fluoroscopy. As I told you, like box radiograph, fluoroscopy, they can be quite useful to screen for heavy metal. So that's some heavy metal in there. That's some contrast that we gave to the bird. You can see that heavy metal intoxication can mimic PDD. There's a very large crop, and the proventriculus is a little bit larger. So there's a gastrointestinal stasis with that. Usually we treat heavy metal, especially lead intoxication with calcium EDTA, needs to be injected, so IM. It does not seem to be toxic in birds as far as the kidney is concerned, so we usually give it as long as it's necessary. We don't attempt to remove the lead particles from the stomach. They would just pass. We just give the calcium EDTA for as long as needed. And we add some sucralfate for the local irritation and some antibiotics. Dystocia, it's fairly, yeah.
So with the calcium EDTA, like if they're eating and everything okay, you don't give that with sub-Q fluids? You just
I think it's better to give it IM or IV. It has better effect.
no, I mean
Oh.
like with fluid therapy because it's not toxic for the kidney, so we don't have to worry about keeping them really well.
Yeah, I guess since they've been regurgitating anyway, and they probably have some gastrointestinal stasis.
Right,
And
once you're trying to get them stable.
no, you don't need to. Usually, we send them home with injections to be given by the owner. So usually, when they're stable and they're rehydrated and everything is in check, we just give calcium EDTA without fluids. Does not seem to be a problem. If you're concerned, you can always give 5 days of it. Just wait for like 1 to 2 days and just resume the therapy.
And then you take an X-ray again.
You can take you can monitor with X-ray or with lead levels in the blood. Yes.
With the heavy metal and the lead toxicity, do you still, if they're in the hospital and you're having gavage feed, do you still increase the fat in the diet?
The fat.
Once recommended, like using peanut butter added to the.
Yeah, you mean for like to make them pass faster? Yeah, actually, if you look at this study, it's very wide standard deviation. So actually, I doubt that any of those treatments is going to have a significant effect in the individual case. But you can try. I think if you just give calcium EDTA and they would resume their normal gastrointestinal motility, it's probably going to be enough. If the particle size is big, it's probably going to take more time. But the ventriculus is fairly, it's fairly abrasive. So I don't think peanut butter. I mean, when you look at the corneal layer of the ventriculus, I don't think peanut butter is going to be all that useful. I mean, it's fairly abrasive in there. But I don't think it's backed up by very strong scientific evidence. But I don't think it's harmful. So maybe you can use it. So dystocia, it's very common as well. It's it can be life-threatening in small birds. In larger birds, actually you can wait. Sometimes you can wait like even several days and they seem to be doing better. There's a lot of vascular disturbances that can happen with that because the egg acts like a huge foreign body and is compressing on some of the vascular trunks. It can also cause some neurological issues on the sciatic nerve and all those nerves that goes in this area. So basically, most of those cases, if they are mildly sick, mild to moderately sick, you can just stabilize them with fluids, pain meds, incubator, calcium gluconate. You need a fairly high dose. You can give it partially IM. If you give it IM, make sure you don't have any blood. Just check that you're not intravascular because if you inject it IV, the bird is going to die just because it's just too high for calcium concentration. And then you just put in an incubator. Most birds, they would pass the egg within 24 hours if there's really no obstruction or nothing else going on. It's always a good idea to take radiographs. It's one of the few instances where you can take a box X-ray just to see if the egg is in oviposition, or if the egg is intact, or if there's only one egg. If there's 2 eggs, it's not going to pass. There's an issue. They don't lay 2 eggs at the same time. If it's not in oviposition, that means that maybe it's not in the uterus, or maybe there's another issue going on. If it's not calcified, there's an issue probably with the shell gland. So it's important because if there's any issue with the oviposition, it doesn't make sense to give oxytocin or to wait too long. Do not give NSAID. So meloxicam are contraindicated in this case because it inhibits prostaglandin synthesis, and prostaglandins are needed for the contraction of the oviduct. And they are important in oviposition, so if you're planning on waiting for the bird to pass that egg on its own, don't give Metacam, so it's not gonna impair the oviductal contraction. Oxytocin works fairly well, even if it's not the hormone, it still works fairly well. It's fairly painful. It seems to be fairly painful when you give it to a bird, but it seems to work okay. Prostaglandin E2 alpha seems to work even better because you can dilate locally the sphincter. It's usually topical. It comes as a gel. If the bird is very sick, if it's deteriorating, or if it's been over 12 hours, 24 hours, it's not gonna pass. The bird needs surgical intervention or some type of intervention. So if the bird is already very sick, obviously putting it in an incubator is not gonna cut it. You need to relieve the obstruction because there's some vascular disturbances going on. There's some compression. Maybe the bird's not being able to urinate because it's compressing the ureteral openings. So would avoid. There's two ways to break the egg. One is to puncture the egg through the cloaca. It's called intracloacal ovosynthesis. And another way is to puncture the egg through the skin. I would avoid that. I don't think it's, most of the time, intracloacal ovosynthesis just works just fine. I think transcutaneous ovosynthesis, there's too much risk to do that. I've never had to do it. I probably did it once because there was no other option and there was no money to do surgery. But you can avoid it in most instances. So for intracloacal ovosynthesis, you need general anesthesia. You need some type of magnification. I mean, it's very small structures. You need to use some type of cloacal speculum or some type of cheek spreaders of rabbits. They work fairly well. So the egg, most of the time, is localized in the oviduct. So the oviduct opens to the left of the urodeum. So you need to go to the left. If you just go straight, you're just going to be in the colon. So you need to find the opening of the oviduct, which is usually fairly large because the bird is prepared to lay the egg. So it's not very hard to find. And then you just work in there until you can see some white. When you see white, that's the eggshell. So you just make a big hole using a very large needle. And usually you cannot aspirate anything because the albumen or the yolk are just too thick. So you just need to increase the hole diameter. So usually I use a mosquito forceps and I just open it. Then I use a very large syringe that I put in there and I just apply some suction, and at the same time I collapse the egg. And usually by the decreased pressure in there, it tends to collapse on its own. And then when you've removed all the albumin and yolk, I kind of shape the egg in form of like I flatten it so it can go like much easily through the cloaca. Or sometimes you can remove it whole, or sometimes you need to remove it piece by piece, and it can take some time. You do not need to remove all the little pieces of eggshell, just most of it. If it takes too much time, if the bird is not stable, you can just recover it. It's going to pass the eggshell or reabsorb the eggshell fairly soon on its own. So that's an example of intracloacal ovosynthesis using endoscopic guided approach. So there's an endoscope here, and there's an endoscopic forceps. And usually punch a hole with the endoscopic forceps and increase the diameter of the hole. But you don't need an endoscope to do that. You can just use some surgical loops or some like local magnification and lighting. And then like slowly and carefully, you can collapse the egg and remove it through the cloaca. If the egg is not in oviposition, or if the egg is not in the uterus or vagina, which means, the egg in oviposition means that the egg is in oviposition. Actually, this egg, surprisingly, is in oviposition. So the small end of the egg needs to be toward the cloaca. The egg needs to be in the caudal abdomen. If it's not like that, it's not in oviposition, so it's not going to work with just supportive care. If the egg is broken, the shell is partially resorbed, and there are several eggs, or the egg looks dead. This egg looks dead because there's a fluid line in it, so it's not solid. Or the egg is intracelomic, or there's a uterus torsion. The egg is not going to come out, so you need to do surgery. You need to do salpingohysterectomy or crush the egg and remove it through the cloaca. Most of the time, when you have something like that, the only way to relieve the impaction is to do salpingohysterectomy through a midline cellulotomy. It's actually surprisingly easy because the egg is just right under the skin and abdomen. So you just need to be obviously very careful and use microsurgical techniques, but it's not hard to do. Dyspnea. So this is a Quaker parrot with open mouth breathing. So usually when they do that, they are severely sick. So they either have upper respiratory tracheal disease or very severe pulmonary air sac disease. The treatment depends on the degree of nature of the dyspnea. You need to characterize the dyspnea in either inspiratory, expiratory, or mixed, open mouth breathing, if there's cyanosis or tail bobbing. So that's an extreme example of dyspnea, but that can be more subtle, like in this tail bobbing. So you can see the tail is moving. Actually, when birds have increased respiratory efforts, they recruit more muscles, and the tail muscles are some of the muscles they recruit to increase and decrease the intra-abdominal pressure. So that's how how it becomes conspicuous. So there's a wide variety of diseases that can cause dyspnea, and without obtaining a diagnosis, it's going to be impossible to treat. You can only stabilize it. So there's tracheal diseases, such as foreign body. It's very common in cockatiels or budgies, small species, where it's usually a millet seed. Tracheal syringeal fungal infection. Tracheal stricture usually happens about 14 days after intubation, and it usually happens in blue and gold macaws. It could happen in some other species. Lower respiratory tract disease, pneumonia seems to be fairly common in chicks, just because they're hand-fed and they tend to aspirate some of their food in the trachea. But bacterial and fungal diseases are common, especially aspergillosis. Birds have a very efficient respiratory system, so they're very susceptible to airborne toxicosis, such as Teflon, PTFE, or any other types of airborne toxin. Extra respiratory disease in birds can cause respiratory clinical signs because of the reduced intracelomic space and reduced air sac volume. So it's typically intracelomic mass, organomegaly, celomic fluid, typically with congestive heart failure or iron storage disease in minor. So a lot of the different diseases that we encounter in birds can lead to dyspnea. So it's a very common clinical sign. So this is an example of a fairly bad air saculitis, when it kind of forms caverns on the X-ray. So you can see very well the air sac membrane, so it's fairly advanced disease. Some example of tracheal diseases that can lead to upper respiratory signs with an aspergilloma in the trachea, so fungal infection of the syrinx, or stenosis secondary to intubation in the blue and gold macaw about 14 days later. So obviously you need a diagnosis because the treatment is not the same. Treatment here is antifungal and debridement with of that mass using the scope. Treatment of that is tracheal resection and anastomosis. So it's a fairly different treatment. For upper respiratory infection, the nice thing about bird that you can bypass the entire upper respiratory tract. That's not without consequences, but you can do it. It's typically done using an air sac tube placement. So the approach is exactly the same as doing an endoscopy in a bird. The leg needs to be pulled forward, and the entry point is between the last rib, the pubic bone, and the flexor cruris medialis muscle. And you just make a little hole with a scalpel blade, then you enlarge the hole, and you puncture the air sac using a mosquito forceps. It needs to be done under anesthesia, obviously. Then you put the endotracheal tube and you tie it to the skin using a Chinese finger trap suture. So as I said, it's not without consequences. You're putting a tube in the body of the bird in about 3 to 5 days. There's going to be tremendous inflammation in there. There's even going to be some focal infection, mainly with aspergillosis and bacterial infection. So the tube needs to be replaced every 3 to 5 days, and you need to address the upper respiratory disease as soon as possible. I usually place the tube with an endoscope, so at the same time can look, I'm doing the exact same type of approach. I usually just do a quick like look around. I just have a quick look around for lesion, and I usually do it after just to make sure there's no focal aspergillosis, because that means the bird's gonna have to be treated for several months with antifungal. And I usually culture the tip of the track tube as well, because it's very common that we have infection. So it causes a lot of damage, promote focal infection, and it's only a temporary solution. If you're not dealing with the issue, the primary problem is not gonna help the bird a whole lot. So that's an example of a cannula in a blue and gold macaw. I usually put a filter on it because it's just an open hole to the air sac, so there's no filtration system at all. So all the feather dust, everything is gonna go in there. So the filtration can be like a surgical mask, like a part of a surgical mask, or you can put other types of filter. You need to be careful with filter because if it gets soaked, then the air does not go very easily through the soaked filter. So coelomic effusion can lead to dyspnea by decreasing the air sac volume. So it happens with congestive heart failure, reproductive associated ascites, neoplastic ascites, or iron storage disease in minor. So it's fairly easy to relieve temporarily. You can confirm it with ultrasound and relieve it by cellulosinthesis. So there's really no specific technique for that. You just put the bird upright and you just palpate, and wherever you think there's the most fluid, you just stick your needle in it and try to aspirate as much fluid as you can. You're not going to be able to aspirate all the fluid because the coelomic cavity of bird is compartmentalized in at least 7 cavities, so you can only remove so much. But usually it's enough to get some fluid analysis, so you can get culture, and you can characterize it into transudate or exudate. I usually measure the cholesterol in the fluid and I compare it to the cholesterol in the plasma. If it's higher in the fluid than in the plasma, it's a high evidence, strong evidence for reproductive associated coelomitis, some egg yolk, basically. I very often, especially in cockatiels, I very often give luprandeslorin implant and a little bit of furosemide, because 90% of the cases are going to be related to reproductive associated diseases in cockatiels. And then you obviously, if it's a transudate, you need a good cardiac workup. Coracoid prolapse, it's another one that is common. It's actually can be very easy to treat temporarily. You just need to make sure you know which part is prolapsed. I mean, it could be the colon, it could be the oviduct, it could be part of the cloaca, typically the coprodeum. Very common disease of laying birds that have laid an egg, or in cockatoos, especially umbrella cockatoos. So usually you need to reduce the swelling using dextrose 50%, and you just put it back in there and use transverse sutures. If the oviduct is prolapsed or the colon is prolapsed and it's necrotic, it's a surgical case. It needs to go in surgery as soon as possible, and you need to perform a resection and anastomosis. It's obviously very challenging, and most of those birds don't make it. But if you wait and you put it back in there, it's going to die anyway. So at least you can try to save the bird's life by performing a surgery and removing the necrotic part. Seizures, I don't know if it's that common, but we still see it every now and then. The most common cause of seizures that we see is the hypocalcemia syndrome of African grey parrots. African grey parrots seem to have the syndrome. We don't really know what's causing it. It seems to be some type of vitamin D metabolism issue. But basically, even if they have enough calcium, they don't have a high ionized calcium, and the seizure because of that. The only way to achieve a diagnosis is to measure the ionized calcium during seizure, when the bird is seizuring. If the bird is not seizuring, most of the time it's going to be normal. Most of the time, when you've ruled out all the metabolic causes of seizures, you really need advanced imaging in order to characterize the lesion, the cause of seizures. So it's MRI. MRI needs to be done as fast as possible, within 24-48 hours. After that time frame, some of those lesions disappear, especially with cerebral edema or ischemia or thrombosis. So it basically needs to be referred as soon as possible if you want a diagnosis. Phenobarbital and potassium bromide are usually ineffective in most birds, especially in African grey parrots. What works very well is the levetiracetam, Keppra, 50 to 100 milligram per kilogram, 3 to 4 times a day. This drug is so safe that you could give like 10 times the dose. It's probably going to work as well, and there's virtually no side effects to this drug. So that's the drug that we use in primary intention for seizure management when we've ruled out the metabolic causes or heavy metal toxicosis as well. Lead and zinc are common causes of seizures. So we're pending the blood level of lead. We frequently treat with calcium EDTA, and we frequently give calcium gluconate and vitamin D as well. That's an example of a partial seizure in an African grey parrot. That African grey parrot had an ischemic stroke that was diagnosed on MRI and was treated successfully. It's been treated for 4 years using Keppra, so it seems to work very well in this parrot. We were able to manage it successfully because we got a diagnosis, so we know it has some type of ischemic stroke, so we can stop doing more diagnostic tests. And we know it's a disease that can progress, or it's a disease that can remain the same, so it's just important to get a diagnosis. So basically the take-home message is that I would like you to remember that the pet bird veterinary science has advanced tremendously over the past 10, 20 years. So, I mean, it's now the medicine that you can perform in pet and companion birds can be as good as small animals. Obviously, there are some challenges because they're small, their physiology is different, because their metabolism is so fast, but there are a lot of information. I mean, 30 years ago, we were all like, I mean, I wasn't even born, I guess I was born, I was a year old. But like 30 years ago, people were like, yeah, there's not that much information on the drug, or we don't have very good values. Well, it's not the case anymore. We have a lot of information, so it's not an excuse not to perform good medicine. And there's tons of information on a variety of diseases of pet birds. So just read some books and read some scientific articles. Emergency stabilization should include oxygen, appropriate free therapy, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and pain management. You should aim for a diagnosis if you want to go beyond stabilization. And it's going to be very difficult for you to achieve a very high success rate if you have little knowledge of the anatomy, physiology, and the common bird diseases. And my final point is that birds are cool and they're worth treating. Thank you. Do you have any questions?